The night of October 12th, 1987, began like any other for the weary roads of Nevada. Long, empty stretches of asphalt swallowing the glow of headlights, the hum of diesel engines, the only sound breaking the silence. But by dawn, something had shifted. A man who had spent half his life navigating those very highways, a trucker known for his punctuality and unshakable routine, had vanished without so much as a whisper. His name was Harold Voss, and when the sun rose that morning, his rig was gone. With him, no distress call, no skid marks on the pavement, no witnesses to a struggle, a scream, or even a single misplaced tire track. Just absence, the kind that gnaws at the edges of reality, that makes a family stare at an empty chair at the dinner table and wonder if they'd somehow dreamed the last 20 years of shared laughter, of phone calls crackling with static from some truck stop in the middle of nowhere. His wife, Margaret, would later say she knew something was wrong the moment the clock struck 3 a.m. Harold always called by 3 a.m., no matter the load, no matter the weather. That night, the phone never rang. The search began, as these things often do, with hope. Law enforcement combed the highways, questioned fellow drivers at rest stops, traced his last known route, a straightforward haul from Reno to a mining outpost near the California border. But the desert doesn't give up its secrets easily. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. Theories sprouted like weeds in the cracks of the case. Robbery gone wrong, a secret life no one knew about, or something far darker, something the quiet folks of those small towns only whispered about after the kids were in bed. The kind of thing that made men glance over their shoulders when the wind howled just a little too loud. And then there was the silence. Not just from Harold, but from the world around him. The CB radio channels he frequented fell quiet, as if the other drivers had collectively held their breath. His regulars at the diner in Winnemucca stopped asking when he'd be back. Even the road itself seemed to forget him, the miles rolling on indifferent, swallowing the memory of his rig like it had never existed at all. But memory is a stubborn thing. It clings. It festers. And for 30 years, it did just that. Until the day the earth itself decided to speak. Because in 2017, deep in the belly of an abandoned mine shaft, construction workers broke through a wall of rock and found something no one was prepared for. Harold's truck, sealed inside, untouched, as if time had stopped the moment he disappeared. Can now, the questions claw their way back to the surface. More urgent than ever, what was he doing there? Who, or what, put him inside that mine? And why, after all these years, has the desert finally decided to give him up? The answers lie buried in the details, in the whispers of those who knew him best, and in the eerie silence that followed his last known transmission. But one thing is certain: Harold Voss didn't just vanish. Something took him, and it's taken 30 years for the truth to begin crawling into the light. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the stretch of highway at dusk, the way the headlights cut through the gathering dark like a blade. Feel the weight of the unknown pressing against your chest, the same way it pressed against Margaret's every night she waited by the phone. Because this isn't just a story about a missing man. It's about the things we choose to forget, the shadows we dismiss, and the moment the past reaches out, cold, unyielding, and demands to be remembered. And if you listen closely, you might just hear the echo of an engine, still running deep beneath the earth. Behind the wheel of his weathered Kenworth 1900, he was more than just a trucker. He was a legend of the long haul, a man who had spent nearly 3 decades carving his name into the asphalt of America's forgotten highways. They called him Iron Mike, not for his build, but for the unshakable resolve that carried him through blizzards, breakdowns, and the lonely nights when the hum of the engine was his only companion. Born in '42 to a family of railroad men, he inherited the road in his blood, but unlike his father, he chose the freedom of the open highway over the rigid tracks of steel. By '87, He had logged over 3 million miles, enough to circle the globe 100 times over. Each journey, a story etched into the worn leather of his driver's seat. His routes were predictable only to him, a labyrinth of backroads and interstates. He navigated with the instinct of a man who knew every crack in the pavement, every diner where the coffee stayed hot past midnight. But it wasn't just the miles that defined him. It was the people, the waitress in Albuquerque, who always saved him a slice of pie. The mechanic in Cheyenne, who'd lie under his rig for hours, refusing payment, because Mike do the same for me. And then there was his CB handle, Midnight Holler, a name whispered across the airwaves by fellow drivers who swore he'd pulled more than one soul from the brink of a jackknife in a storm. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays, who sent postcards from truck stops, who kept a Polaroid of his granddaughter taped to the dash, her gap-toothed smile, the last thing he'd see before turning the key dot. But in the weeks leading up to that final run, something had shifted. His logbook, usually meticulous, bore smudged entries, as if written in haste. Dispatch records later revealed he'd taken a last-minute detour, a route no one could explain, a stretch of blacktop leading to the old Silver Cliff mine, a place locals avoided, whispering about cave-ins and the ghosts of miners who'd never come back up. His wife would later tell investigators about the phone call, the one where his voice cracked just slightly when he mentioned a shortcut. A shortcut from a man who prided himself on knowing every inch of the map. Then there was the truck stop clerk in Durango, who'd served him coffee the night before he vanished. She'd sworn under oath that he wasn't alone. A man in a dark coat had been watching him from the parking lot, just standing there, hands in his pockets, as the rain turned the neon signs to blurs. And yet, no one connected the dots, not when his rig failed to check in, not when his CB fell silent, not even when his grandson, playing in the attic a month later, found a crumpled napkin in his jacket pocket. Scribbled in Mike's handwriting were coordinates. Coordinates that would, decades later, lead straight to the rusted gates of Silver Cliff. The clues were there, flickering like distant headlights in the fog. But in '87, they were just whispers lost in the static of a world that had already moved on. Now, as the wind howls through the skeletal remains of the mine, one has to wonder, what did Iron Mike see in those final moments? What made a man who knew every rule of the road break his own patterns? And why, after 30 years of silence, did the earth finally decide to give him back? The answers lie buried deeper than the shaft itself, but the question lingers, heavy as the diesel fumes in the cold morning air. What, or who, was he running from? And more importantly, is it still out there? The clock struck midnight on October 12, 1987, and with each passing hour, the silence grew heavier. The trucker, known to his family as a man who kept his word, who called home without fail, had vanished into the night. By dawn, the first calls were made, voices trembling as they dialed the numbers of dispatchers, fellow drivers, even the diner waitress, who always poured his coffee black, no sugar. But no one had seen him. No one had heard from him. And as the sun rose over the empty highway, so did the dread. Authorities launched the search within hours, combing the last known stretch of his route, a desolate two-lane road winding through the foothills, where the trees grew thick and the cell service died. State troopers scoured the shoulders for skid marks, for signs of a struggle, for anything that might explain how a man in his 18-wheeler could simply cease to exist. Bloodhounds were brought in, their noses pressed to the asphalt, tracing the scent of diesel and worn leather from the driver's seat. But the trail went cold too soon, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. His family refused to accept it. His wife, her hands clenched around a photograph of him grinning beside his rig, organized search parties. Volunteers, neighbors, fellow truckers, even strangers moved by the plea in her voice, fanned out with flashlights and two-way radios, calling his name into the dark. They checked abandoned gas stations, derelict rest stops, every shadowy turnoff where a man might pull over for a moment's rest. But the only answer was the wind. Then came the whispers. the doubts. The way the investigators' eyes flickered with something unspoken when they delivered their updates, or lack thereof. The case file grew thicker with dead ends. A reported sighting in a truck stop 200 miles north that led nowhere. A partial license plate match that dissolved under scrutiny. The media moved on. The public's attention waned, but in the quiet of their home, his daughter would press her ear to the phone at night, willing it to ring with his voice on the other end. His son would stare at the empty driveway, half expecting to see the headlights cut through the dark. Hope is a fragile thing, and as weeks turned to months, it began to crack under the weight of silence. The trucker's CB handle, Long Haul Larry, fell quiet on the airwaves. His usual parking spot at the depot remained empty. The missing persons poster on the diner bulletin board yellowed at the edges, its corners peeling away, like the resolve of those who had once believed he'd walk through the door. Some said he'd run. Others muttered about foul play. But the truth was worse. No one knew, and in that not knowing, the wound never closed. What do you do when the world moves on, but you can't? When every unanswered call, every unopened door, every anniversary marked by absence feels like a fresh betrayal? The search never really ended. Not for them. It just changed. No longer about finding him alive, but about finding him at all. And in that shift, something darker took root. Because if he wasn't out there somewhere, then where was he? And what had been hidden so well that not even the dogs could find it? The years stretched on, like an endless highway under a moonless sky, each passing season swallowing another fragment of hope. By the early 1990s, the case of the vanished trucker, once a blaring headline, had faded into the quiet corners of police file cabinets, its pages yellowing with neglect. Investigators, once fueled by urgency, now sighed as they flipped through the same worn photographs. The empty rest stop where his rig was last seen, the half-finished coffee cup left on the dashboard, the logbook with its final entry scrawled in hurried handwriting. The clues had gone cold, but the questions lingered, heavy as the diesel fumes that once clung to his jacket. The community, too, carried the weight of his absence. His wife, a woman who had once stood vigilant by the phone, now moved through her days with a hollow precision, her hands automatically stirring coffee she no longer tasted. His children grew into adults who only knew their father through faded Polaroids and the ghost of his laughter in old home videos. Neighbors whispered less about conspiracy theories and more about the cruel indifference of time. Had he simply walked away? Had the road claimed him in some unseen accident? Or had something far darker pulled him into the shadows? Law enforcement, pressed by newer cases and dwindling resources, revisited the file only when guilt or duty demanded it. A detective, now gray-haired and weary, would occasionally drive the old route, scanning the tree line as if the truth might suddenly emerge from the pines. But the land stayed silent. The trucker's CB handle, Midnight Howler, fell into legend among long-haul drivers, a cautionary tale muttered over static-laced radios during late-night runs. Some swore they'd heard his voice crackling through the airwaves on quiet nights, a phantom transmission from beyond the veil. By the turn of the millennium, resignation had settled like dust over the case. The missing person posters curled at the edges, their colors bleached by the sun. His family stopped giving interviews, their voices raw from repeating the same pleading details. The world moved on. Highways were repaved. Rest stops were renovated. And yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind howled through the canyons where he'd last been seen, there were those who still listened for the growl of an engine, for the creak of a rig door swinging open, for any sign that the road had finally given up its secret dot. But the years passed, and the silence deepened, until one day, in a place no one had thought to look, the earth itself decided to speak. The sun hung low over the jagged peaks of Black Ridge on that October morning in 2023, casting long skeletal shadows across the scarred earth where construction crews had been carving into the mountainside for weeks. The air was thick with the metallic tang of disturbed soil and the acrid bite of diesel fumes from the idling excavators. Yet beneath it all, something else lingered, a damp, cloying stillness, like the breath of a place that had been undisturbed for decades. The workers had grown accustomed to the usual groans of shifting rock, the occasional scuttle of unseen things in the dark crevices they exposed. But this was different. Then came the sound that stopped them all. Not a collapse, not a machine's groan. No, it was the hollow thud of metal striking something solid beneath the rubble, a resonance that didn't belong. The foreman, a grizzled man named Harlan Reeves, signaled for silence. The drones of the engines faded into an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant cry of a crow circling overhead. And there, half buried in the loosened earth, was the unmistakable curve of a rusted fender. Not just any fender. His fender, the faded red of a 1979 Kenworth W900, its once polished chrome now dulled by time, peeking through the dirt like a ghost, refusing to stay buried. Hands trembled as they cleared the debris, not from the cold, but from the creeping realization of what they were uncovering. The mine shaft yawned before them, its entrance partially collapsed, sealed by decades of rock slides and neglect. Yet somehow, the truck had been placed there, deliberately. The beams of their helmets flickered over the cab, still intact, its windows caked with grime, but unbroken. The door handles were locked. The tires, though cracked with age, still held their shape, as if the rig had been driven in yesterday and left to slumber in the dark. And then there was the smell, faint but unmistakable. Not just rust and mildew, but something older, something human. A hush fell over the crew as Harlan reached out, his gloved fingers brushing against the driver's side window. The dust swirled in the beam of his light, revealing something etched into the glass, faint but legible. A single word, scratched as if in haste. Wait. The radio on his belt crackled to life, a staticky voice from the site office, asking for an update. But Harlan didn't answer. He couldn't, because at that moment, the wind howled down the shaft, carrying with it a whisper, just 3 words, so soft they might have been imagined. Too late now. The first responders would arrive within the hour. The coroner's van would follow, and the world would soon know what had been hidden in the belly of Black Ridge for 36 years. But for those few suspended minutes, as the beam of Harlan's light trembled over the sealed cab, there was only the weight of the unseen. The truck wasn't just found. It had been waiting, and whatever or whoever had left it there had made sure it stayed that way. Now the question wasn't just what had happened to the driver all those years ago. It was what had been keeping him company in the dark. The moment the rusted metal door of the mine shaft groaned open, a breath of stale, mineral-laden air escaped, thick with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something unnervingly preserved. The construction workers stood frozen, their flashlights trembling as the beams cut through the darkness, revealing the unthinkable. There, deep within the belly of the abandoned mine, rested the skeletal frame of a semi-truck, its once vibrant red paint now faded to a ghostly maroon, as if the very walls had bled into its surface over 3 decades. The rig was sealed inside the cavern, like a relic entombed by time itself, its tires still inflated, its chrome bumper gleaming dully under the artificial light, as though it had been parked just yesterday. But it was what lay inside the cab that sent a chill spiraling down their spines. The driver's side door was locked from within, the window rolled up tight, as if the trucker had deliberately shut himself in, or worse, as if something had shut him in. Through the dust-caked glass, the faint outline of a figure could be seen slumped over the wheel, a silhouette frozen in the final act of a journey that had ended in 1987. The workers' radios crackled to life as one of them stammered into the device, his voice breaking with a mix of terror and disbelief. Within minutes, The wail of sirens echoed through the canyon, and the first responders arrived, their boots crunching over the brittle remains of decades-old debris. A seasoned paramedic, his hands steady from years of emergencies, reached for the door handle, only to recoil as if burned. The truck wasn't just locked, it was sealed. A thin layer of congealed substance, later identified as a mixture of dried clay and some unknown adhesive, had been meticulously applied along every seam, every crevice, as though someone, or something, had wanted to ensure whatever was inside stayed exactly as it was left. Then came the moment the door was finally breached. The hinges screamed in protest as the jaws of life pried them apart, and the stale air inside rushed out in a single putrid exhale. The cab was a time capsule of horror. The trucker's logbook lay open on the passenger seat, its pages yellowed but legible, the final entry scrawled in frantic, jagged handwriting. "They're in the walls. Don't let them." The rest was smeared, as if the pen had been dropped mid-sentence. His thermos, still half full of coffee now reduced to a black sludge, sat beside a half-eaten sandwich, its bread petrified into something resembling stone. And there, in the driver's seat, was the man himself, or what remained of him. His overalls were intact, his boots still laced, but his body had long since succumbed to the slow, relentless work of time. Yet his face was turned toward the passenger side, eyes wide, mouth agape in a silent scream, as if he had seen something in his final moments that had stolen his voice forever. The investigators who arrived on scene later that day would describe the atmosphere as electric, not with the hum of machinery, but with the weight of unanswered questions pressing in from all sides. Why had the truck been sealed inside the mine? What had the trucker seen or heard in those last moments? And most haunting of all, why had no one come looking for him until now? The mine's records showed it had been condemned in 1985, 2 years before his disappearance. Yet somehow, his rig had found its way into its depths, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. As the truck was carefully extracted, piece by piece, the workers and first responders couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just uncovering a vehicle. They were unearthing a secret, one that had been buried for a reason. And reasons, as any seasoned investigator knows, are the first threads in the tapestry of the truth. But in this case, the threads led not to answers, at least not yet, but to more questions, each one darker than the last. What waits in the shadows of an abandoned mine is often more than dust and decay. Sometimes, it's the echo of a voice, crying out from the past, begging to be heard. And this voice, it was just beginning to speak. The moment the rusted doors of that abandoned mine creaked open, revealing the trucker's rig frozen in time, the case ceased to be a cold file. It became a living, breathing enigma. And now, it falls to a select few to step into the shadows where others dared not look. These are the investigators, seasoned by decades of unresolved disappearances, their instincts honed by the ghosts of cases that still whisper in their dreams. They carry more than badges and forensic kits. They carry the weight of a family's 30-year silence, the unanswered prayers of a man who vanished into the night, and the haunting question that now claws at them: what, or who, sealed him in there? Detective Elias Voss, a man whose sharp gaze has dissected crime scenes from highway ditches to backwoods cabins, leads the team. His hands, steady as they log evidence, betray the faintest tremor when he traces the trucker's last known route on a yellowed map. He's seen missing persons cases before, but never one where the answer was buried so literally, locked away in the belly of a mine that shouldn't have been accessible in 1987. His partner, forensic anthropologist Dr. Lila Chen, moves with clinical precision, her gloved fingers brushing over the truck's interior, where dust has settled like a shroud. She doesn't just see a preserved cabin. She sees the final moments of a life interrupted, the half-drunk coffee in the cup holder, the logbook open to a page, smudged with what might be fingerprints, or something darker. Each detail is a scream in the silence, and she's learned to listen. Then there's retired State Trooper Harlan Graves, pulled back into service because he was the last officer to speak to the trucker at a way station the night he disappeared. Graves remembers the man's voice, the way he'd laughed about the old CB radio, crackling with ghost stories from other drivers. Now, standing in the mine's damp gloom, he hears that laughter echoing differently. The team leans on his institutional memory, but he leans on something else. The gut-wrenching certainty that this wasn't an accident. Mines don't seal themselves. Trucks don't drive in on their own. And men don't vanish without a reason. Their methods are meticulous, almost ritualistic. Voss cross-references the truck's black box data with weather reports from that night, searching for the storm that might have forced a detour. Chen scrapes residue from the door seals, testing for traces of explosives or manual tampering. Graves walks the perimeter of the mine, his flashlight cutting through the dark, recreating the trucker's possible path. Because if you want to know how a man disappeared, you start by becoming him. But it's the emotional toll that lingers long after the evidence bags are sealed. Voss keeps a photo of the trucker's daughter, now in her 50s, tucked in his notebook. Chen's sleep is fractured by dreams of sealed doors. And Graves? He started leaving his police radio on at night, as if waiting for a transmission from 1987. This isn't just another case, it's a reckoning. For 30 years, the Earth held its secrets. Now the investigators must decide, do they dig for the truth, no matter how brutal, or do they let some mysteries stay buried? But the trucker's rig, sitting in that mine like a time capsule of dread, has already made the choice for them. The question is no longer if they'll find answers. It's whether they're ready for what those answers will demand of them. Close your eyes and ask yourself, if you were them, standing at the edge of that mine, the air thick with the scent of old metal and older lies, would you step forward, or would you too become another ghost in this story? The moment the rusted latch of the truck's cab groaned open, a breath of stale air escaped. 30 years trapped in darkness, carrying with it the ghost of a man who had simply vanished. Investigator Daniel Mercer hesitated, his flashlight cutting through the dust motes, swirling like restless spirits. The interior was a time capsule, untouched since 1987, a half-drunk thermos, still smelling faintly of black coffee, sat in the cup holder. The logbook lay open on the passenger seat, its final entry scrawled in hurried, slanted handwriting. Route 17 detour. Mine access road. Something's off. Radio's dead. The words clung to the page like a warning whispered across decades. Every detail was a clue, a fragment of the trucker's final hours. Mercer's gloved fingers traced the dashboard, where a family photo had been wedged behind the speedometer. A woman, 2 children, their smiles frozen in a moment of happiness that now felt like a cruel irony. The trucker, Richard Holloway, had been a man of routine, a veteran of the long haul, who knew every back road between Chicago and Denver. So why had he deviated? The mine's entrance had been sealed with fresh concrete in '87, yet Holloway's rig was found inside, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. And then there were the scratches, deep, frantic grooves etched into the door frame from the inside, as though someone or something had tried to claw their way out. Forensic analysts descended on the scene, their tools humming with modern precision against the weight of a 30-year-old mystery. The truck's CB radio, though corroded, still held a final, staticky transmission. A voice, not Holloway's, cutting through the interference with 3 chilling words. "They're watching you." The recording was degraded, but the terror in the speaker's tone was unmistakable. Meanwhile, Holloway's personal effects told a quieter, More haunting story. A crumpled letter in his glove compartment, postmarked a week before his disappearance, hinted at financial trouble. A second mortgage on the family home. A desperate plea to a brother he hadn't spoken to in years. Was this a man running from his past, or toward something far darker? The mine itself seemed to resist revelation. Geologists confirmed the concrete seal had been poured after the truck entered, raising a horrifying question. Had Holloway been lured into a trap, or had he known something he shouldn't have? Mercer's team found traces of diesel fuel, leading deeper into the tunnels, as if the truck had been driven further in before being abandoned. But the tunnels ended abruptly, collapsed in a way that didn't match natural cave-ins. Someone had wanted this place forgotten. As the pieces assembled, the investigation took on a life of its own, pulling at threads that unraveled more than just a missing persons case. Holloway's final days painted a portrait of a man unraveling. Late-night calls to old military buddies, cryptic notes about deliveries that didn't add up. And then there was the mine's history. A place rumored to have been used for Cold War experiments, its records classified until the late 90s. Coincidence? Mercer didn't believe in them. The deeper they dug, the more the past pushed back. Now, with Holloway's truck exhumed from its concrete tomb, the question isn't just what happened to him, but who ensured he'd never be found. And as the first light of dawn creeps over the mine's entrance, one truth becomes inescapable. Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried. What would you do if you uncovered a lie this big? Would you walk away or keep digging, no matter the cost? Behind the cold steel of the rig, sealed in the suffocating dark of the abandoned mine, lay more than just a truck. It was a time capsule of a man's unspoken struggles, a life suspended between duty and despair. Investigators knew James "Jimmy" Calloway wasn't just another missing person. He was a husband who left behind a wife whose letters to him went unanswered for decades, a father whose daughter still kept his last voicemail on an old answering machine, and a veteran of the road whose logbooks told a story far darker than the open highway. The clues inside the cab painted a portrait of a man unraveling. A crumpled receipt from a diner near the mine, dated 2 days before his disappearance, bore a scribbled note in Jimmy's hand. "Meet me at the old shaft. Midnight. No cops." The ink was smeared, as if written in haste or fear. His CB radio, still tuned to a dead channel, had been modified with a frequency scanner, a tool truckers used to evade way stations, but also one that could intercept private transmissions. And then there was the photograph, tucked behind the sun visor. Jimmy, arms slung around a man whose face had been violently scratched out. The same man appeared in a faded Polaroid from Jimmy's home, standing beside him at a union rally years earlier. A rally that ended in accusations, threats, and a union boss found dead in his office the next week. The mine itself whispered secrets. Locals spoke of Jimmy's late-night visits in the months before he vanished, how he'd park his rig at the mouth of the tunnel and sit for hours, engine idling, as if waiting for something or someone. His wife, Margaret, had once confided to a friend that Jimmy had been receiving calls from a blocked number, his voice tightening each time he hung up. He wasn't hauling freight those last trips, she'd said. He was hauling ghosts. And then there was the ledger, hidden beneath the truck's sleeper berth, its pages filled with coded entries, dates, locations, and sums of money that didn't match his pay stubs. One entry stood out, $10,000, marked silence, the same amount deposited into an account under a false name the day before he disappeared. The community remembered Jimmy as a man who carried the weight of more than just his cargo. The bartender at the truck stop recalled how he'd nurse a single beer for hours, staring at the door like he expected someone to walk in and change his fate. The mechanic who serviced his rig swore Jimmy had asked him, just days before vanishing, how to disable a truck's black box. "Just in case," he'd muttered. And then there was the preacher at the chapel by the highway, who claimed Jimmy had come to him the night before his last run, not for confession, but for a favor. "If I don't come back, tell Margaret it wasn't her fault." As the pieces converged, the question ceased to be where Jimmy had gone, but why the mine had become his tomb. The answers lay buried in the fractures of his life, in the relationships that had turned to quicksand beneath him, and in the choices that had led him down a road far darker than the one he drove. The rig wasn't just found, it was placed there, with a precision that spoke of betrayal, of a debt called due in the dead of night. And as the beam of a flashlight flickered over the final clue, a single rusted key, hidden in the glove compartment, stamped with the logo of a defunct mining company. The air in that sealed chamber grew heavier still, because keys don't just unlock doors. Sometimes they open floods, and this one was about to drown them all in the truth. The night swallowed James Holloway whole in 1987, leaving behind only the hum of his idling engine, a half-finished cup of coffee at the diner counter, and a logbook with its final entry scrawled in his familiar, hurried hand. But as the rusted doors of that abandoned mine groaned open 3 decades later, they didn't just reveal his rig, preserved like a relic in some forgotten cathedral of steel. They cracked open a vault of questions darker than the shaft itself. What force, human or otherwise, could have sealed a 40-ton tractor trailer inside a mine with such eerie precision? And why, in all the years of searches, had no one, not even the miners who once worked those tunnels, ever whispered a word about what lay buried in its depths? Theories slither through the case, like shadows in the headlights of Holloway's own rig. Some say the mine wasn't abandoned at all that night, that it was a front, its yawning mouth concealing operations far removed from coal and copper. Witnesses, their voices trembling with the weight of old fears, speak of lights flickering deep in the tunnels long after the last official shift ended, of men in unmarked trucks, rolling in under cover of darkness, their cargo never logged, their faces never seen. Could Holloway have stumbled onto something he wasn't meant to see? The logbook's final entry, a cryptic note about a shortcut through Black Ridge, takes on a sinister new meaning when paired with the mine's unofficial nickname among locals, the back door. Was he lured, or did he follow a path he thought he knew, only to find it led straight into the abyss? Then there are the others, the ones who insist this was no act of men, but of the mountain itself. The miners who refused to set foot near the shaft where Holloway's rig was found, their superstitions as deep-rooted as the veins of ore they once chased. They'll tell you, in hushed tones, about the way the air changes down there, how the walls seem to breathe, how the silence isn't empty but waiting. How, in the weeks before Holloway vanished, the mine's old ventilation system would groan to life in the dead of night. Though the power had been cut for years, was it a collapse that sealed him in, a pocket of gas that left no trace, or something older, hungrier, that the mountain had been hiding long before Holloway's headlights ever pierced its dark? And what of the rig itself? The investigators who first laid eyes on it describe an unsettling stillness, not the decay of 30 years, but the suspended animation of a moment frozen in time. The cab's interior, untouched by dust or rust, as if the mine had preserved it. The keys still in the ignition, the CB radio, tuned to a dead channel, its last transmission never logged. Most chilling of all, the driver's seat, reclined just enough to suggest someone had settled in for a long wait, or had been placed there by unseen hands. Forensic reports hint at traces of sediment on the tires, not from the roads Holloway traveled, but from deep within the mine's lower shafts. Sediment that shouldn't have been there unless the truck had been driven into the dark long after its driver was gone. The truth, if it exists, is buried deeper than the rig. But as the beam of the investigators' flashlights flicker over the mine's jagged walls, one question burns brighter than the rest. What was down there with him? She was 12 when he vanished, old enough to remember the scent of his aftershave, the way his calloused hands would ruffle her hair before a long haul. But memory is a cruel thing. Over the years, the edges of his face blurred in photographs. His voice dissolved into static in her mind. She'd lie awake at night, tracing the routes he used to drive on a map, her fingers pressing into the paper as if she could will him back from the ink. The not knowing was worse than grief. Grief had an end. This, this was a wound that never closed. Then came the call, the mine, the truck, and suddenly, the past wasn't just a ghost. It was a corpse, exhumed. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling around a chipped mug of cold coffee, staring at the detective's badge like it was a relic from another life. They had found Daniel's rig, sealed, as if someone or something had wanted it hidden. The implications coiled around her ribs, squeezing. Was he still inside? Had he suffered? Or had he walked away, leaving behind a life that no longer fit him? The questions were sharper now, jagged things, cutting through the numbness she'd worn, like armor for decades. Arthur Clare stood in the driveway that evening, the autumn wind biting at her cheeks, and watched the news vans pull up. Reporters with hungry eyes and microphones, like weapons. They wanted answers. She wanted to scream, because what if the truth was worse than the silence? What if the mine didn't just hold a truck, but a confession? One that would shatter the fragile story she'd told herself for years. That he was out there, somewhere, alive, that he'd chosen to leave, that she wasn't worth staying for. The investigation pressed on, each revelation a fresh bruise, a logbook with the last entry smudged, as if written in haste, a thermos, still half full of coffee gone stale with time, and the mine itself, its mouth gaping like a warning. Eleanor would sit by the phone, her breath shallow, waiting for the call that would finally tell her whether to mourn or to rage. But the mine kept its secrets close, its darkness whispering of things better left buried. And so the Whitmores remained suspended, caught between the agony of hope and the terror of certainty. Because some answers don't bring peace. Some only deepen the abyss. And in the end, the most haunting question isn't what happened, but could we have stopped it? The truck may have been found, but Daniel was still missing. And in the quiet hours, when the house groaned under the weight of its own silence, they could all still hear the echo of his keys jingling by the door. Just before he walked out for the last time, the mine had always been there. Long before the trucker vanished, long before the first whispers of its curse took root in the hollows of the town, a jagged scar in the earth, its mouth gaping like a warning, as if the mountain itself had exhaled something foul and never bothered to close its lips again. Locals called it the Devil's Breath, a name that clung to it like the damp rot on its wooden supports. By the 1950s, it was already abandoned, its veins of ore long bled dry. But the stories, those never stopped flowing. Miners spoke of shadows that moved when the lanterns flickered, of voices that echoed back at them in languages no one recognized. By the time 1987 rolled around, the mine had become less a place and more a fable, a cautionary tale. Parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. But fables, as it turns out, have teeth. And then there was the trucker, a man who knew every back road, every shortcut between the interstates and the forgotten towns that dotted them. He wouldn't have taken the old service road near the mine by accident. No, if he ended up there, it was because something or someone had led him. The question is, why? The mine's history is a tapestry of disappearances, not just of men, but of things. Tools left overnight would vanish by morning. Entire carts of ore gone without a trace. In 1963, a prospector swore he saw a rig identical to the one found decades later, parked just inside the entrance, its engine still humming, its cab empty. When he returned with the sheriff, there was nothing, just the stale, metallic tang of the air and the sense that something was watching them from the dark. Investigators now stand at the edge of that same darkness, their flashlights carving thin beams into the gloom. The trucker's rig wasn't just found, it was placed. The mine's entrance had been sealed with timber and rock, not by nature, but by hands that wanted to keep something inside, or perhaps something out. The deeper they go, the more the air thickens, not just with dust, but with the weight of something older, something that doesn't belong to this world. The walls seem to breathe. The silence isn't empty, it's listening. And then there are the markings. Scratches in the rock, too deliberate to be accidental, too fresh to be decades old. Symbols, a message, or the desperate clawing of a man who realized, too late, that he wasn't alone down here. The mind doesn't give up its secrets easily. It never has. But as the beams of light flicker over the rusted hull of the truck, one thing becomes painfully clear. This was never just a disappearance. It was an offering. And the question that now gnaws at the edges of every investigator's mind isn't just what happened to the trucker, but what did he bring back with him? The answers lie deeper in the dark, coiled like a serpent, waiting. And the mine, it's smiling. As the beam of the investigator's flashlight cut through the suffocating dark, it revealed something far more chilling than rusted rails or crumbling timber. Proof that the mine had been hiding more than just the trucker's rig. Tucked between the warped wooden beams of a long collapsed support tunnel, a series of faded ledgers surfaced, their pages brittle with age, but their entries still legible, and what they contained sent a ripple of unease through the team. Because these weren't just records of ore yields or shift rotations. No, these were names, dozens of them, meticulously logged alongside dates, stretching back to the late 1970s, each one followed by a single, ominous notation. Delivered. The handwriting was precise, almost clinical, but the ink bore the faintest tremor, as if the person who'd written them had been fighting to keep their composure. And then there were the margins, scrawled in hasty, frantic script, half hidden beneath the official entries, were phrases that made the blood run cold. They don't ask questions. After the third load, the new guy won't last the week. He knew too much, took care of it. The dates aligned eerily with a string of unsolved disappearances in the region. Long-haul drivers, drift workers, even a state trooper who'd pulled over a truck near the mine's old access road in '82. And then, on the very last page, a name that stopped them dead in their tracks. James R. Calloway, the trucker who vanished in '87. But it wasn't the name itself that sent a chill down their spines. It was the date beside it. Because according to the ledger, James Calloway had made his delivery nearly 2 weeks after he was reported missing. The implications were staggering. Someone had been using this mine, not just as a dumping ground, but as a hub, a place where the unwanted, the troublesome, the knowing were sent, never to return. And if the ledger was to be believed, the operation hadn't ended with Calloway. Further into the tunnel, half buried beneath a slide of loose shale, they found a rusted metal locker. Inside, a collection of personal effects, a child's hair ribbon, still tied in a bow, a Zippy's Diner matchbook from a town 200 miles east, a dog-eared photo of a young couple, the edges singed as if someone had tried to burn it, then thought better of it. But the most damning discovery was a single, yellowed business card, its edges frayed, but the embossed logo still clear. Blackthorn Logistics, a trucking company that had gone bankrupt in the early '90s under a cloud of fraud allegations. The same company that had employed James Calloway. Now the questions burned hotter than the acetylene torches, cutting through the mine's sealed chambers. Who was pulling the strings? And more terrifyingly, who was still protecting them? Because as the team radioed in their findings, the static on the other end of the line wasn't just interference, it was breathing. And when the connection finally cleared, the voice that answered wasn't their dispatcher's, it was a man's voice, low and gravelly, the kind that carried the weight of too many secrets. "You shouldn't have come back," it said. "Some doors ain't meant to be opened." Then the line went dead, and somewhere in the depths of the mine, a distant thud echoed through the tunnels, like the sound of a pickaxe biting into stone, or a shovel digging fresh earth. The truth was here, but so was something else, something that had been waiting for them. And as the last flicker of daylight vanished from the mine's entrance, one thing became painfully clear. They weren't just uncovering a conspiracy, they were waking it up. So ask yourself, how far would you go to find the answers? And when the shadows start whispering your name, would you have the courage to listen, or would you run, like so many before you, and let the dark swallow the truth whole? The deeper they ventured into the mine's suffocating embrace, the heavier the air grew, not just with the damp, metallic tang of rusted iron and decay, but with something far more unsettling, a silence so thick it pressed against their eardrums, broken only by the occasional drip, drip of unseen water, echoing from the shadows. Investigators had followed the trail of the trucker's vanished rig this far, but now the mine seemed to resist them. Flashlights flickered without warning, their beams stuttering like dying breaths against the jagged walls, as if the darkness itself was pushing back. One officer swore his radio hissed with static voices when no one else was transmitting. Another claimed the temperature plummeted by 10 degrees in a span of seconds, their breath fogging in the sudden cold. Rational explanations were offered: faulty equipment, drafts from unseen shafts. But the unease coiled tighter in their chests with every step. Then came the odors, not the expected stench of stagnant water or mildew, but something acrid and wrong, like burnt wiring, mixed with the faint, coppery bite of old blood. A seasoned detective paused mid-stride, his boot hovering over a patch of disturbed gravel. The pebbles weren't scattered by time or erosion. They'd been moved. Recently, the realization sent a ripple through the team. Someone, or something, had been here ahead of them, and it didn't want to be found. The emotional toll was visible in the way hands trembled around flashlights, in the two quick glances over shoulders. One investigator, a hardened woman with 2 decades on missing persons cases, excused herself to the tunnel's mouth, her face ashen. She'd later admit she'd heard her name whispered in the dark, in a voice that wasn't her own. Others reported shadows, shifting at the edges of their vision, just out of focus, as if the mine's history was pressing in on them, demanding to be acknowledged. The trucker's rig sat ahead, its sealed cab a silent monolith in the gloom. But the closer they got, the more the mine seemed to breathe, a low, rhythmic groan of settling rock, or perhaps something far more deliberate. They were missing something, a piece of the puzzle hidden not in the physical evidence, but in the feeling of the place. The mine wasn't just a crime scene, it was a witness, and it was watching them back. What would you do, standing in that suffocating dark, knowing the answers you sought might unravel more than just a decades-old disappearance? Would you press forward, or listen to the instinct screaming that some doors should never be opened? The air inside the abandoned mine had grown thicker, heavier. Each breath the investigators took seemed to carry the weight of 3 decades of silence. The flickering beams of their flashlights cut through the dust like knives, revealing the jagged walls of the tunnel ahead. Then, just as the tension threatened to snap, a voice crackled over the radio. "We've got something." Those 3 words sent a jolt through the team, a mix of dread and exhilaration coiling in their chests, because this wasn't just another dead end. This was the moment everything changed. Deep in the belly of the mine, where the darkness had lain undisturbed for years, the trucker's rig stood frozen in time. Its once vibrant red paint was now dulled by grime, but the seal around it was eerily intact, almost as if someone had wanted it hidden, not lost. The door creaked open with a groan, and the scent of stale air and something faintly metallic rushed out. Inside, the cab was pristine. The keys still dangled in the ignition. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat in the holder, the liquid long since evaporated, leaving behind a ghostly ring of residue. And then there was the logbook. Its pages were filled with the trucker's familiar handwriting, each entry meticulous routine, until the final one. The words scrawled there weren't coordinates or delivery notes. They were a plea. They're in the walls. The investigators' radios erupted in a storm of voices, but no one moved. The implication hung in the air like a curse. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a wrong turn. The trucker hadn't vanished. He'd been taken, and whatever had taken him had left the rig here, untouched, as if daring someone to find it. The mine's shadows seemed to deepen, the silence pressing in like a living thing. One of the officers reached for the logbook, fingers trembling as they traced the ink. The paper was brittle, but the fear in those words was still fresh, still alive. Then came the sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping from deeper in the tunnel. The team froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the settling of old wood. It was deliberate, measured, like something answering back. The flashlights swung toward the darkness, but the beams only made the shadows dance, and in that moment, the investigators understood. They weren't just solving a mystery, they were stepping into one. The trucker's disappearance wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far darker. Now, as the truth claws its way to the surface, one question burns brighter than the rest. What else is down here? And more importantly, what does it want? The answers lie just beyond the reach of their lights, waiting in the suffocating dark. But are they ready to face them? Or will this mine claim another soul before the night is through? The moment the rusted lock groaned open, releasing a breath of stale, mineral-laden air from the mine's depths, the truth ceased to be an abstraction. It became something tangible, something heavy. The investigators stood frozen, flashlights trembling in their grips, as the beams cut through decades of darkness, illuminating the cab of the truck, still parked, as if its driver had just stepped away for a moment. But the seat was empty. The steering wheel, once gripped by calloused hands, now bore the ghostly imprint of time, dust settling like a shroud over the dashboard. And then there was the logbook, its pages yellowed but intact, the final entry scrawled in a hand that had shaken with urgency. There in the walls, "Don't trust the rest was lost to a jagged tear, as if the words themselves had been ripped from reality. For Detective Harlan Reeves, a man who had spent half his career chasing this case, the discovery wasn't relief. It was a fracture. His fingers traced the edge of the truck's door, the metal cold despite the oppressive heat of the mine. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with the creeping dread that the answers they'd sought for 30 years might not be answers at all, but another layer of the unknown. His partner, Martinez, exhaled sharply, her breath hitching, as she lifted a faded photograph from the glove compartment. The family portrait, its edges curled with age. The trucker's wife, Margaret, had kept that same photo on her nightstand, her fingertips worn smooth from tracing the faces of her husband and their 2 sons, now grown men, with lines of their own grief etched into their skin. Back in the precinct, the weight of the findings pressed down like the mine's collapsed ceiling. Reeves watched through the two-way mirror as Margaret clutched the logbook, her knuckles white, her lips moving silently as she read the final entry again and again. When she finally spoke, her voice was a rasp, raw with 3 decades of unshed tears. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew something was wrong, and he tried to tell us." Her older son Jake sat rigid beside her, his jaw clenched so tight Reeves could see the muscle twitch. The younger one, Eli, had his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking. It wasn't just the confirmation of their father's fate that shattered them. It was the realization that his last moments had been spent in terror, in a desperate attempt to warn them of something they still couldn't name. The town, too, felt the reverberations. Whispers slithered through diners and gas stations, the same places where rumors had festered for years. But now, the stories weren't just campfire tales. They were anchored in the rusted hull of that truck, in the torn pages of a logbook, in the way Margaret's hands trembled when she spoke of the things in the walls. Reeves had seen this before, the way a single discovery could unravel a community's fragile peace. The mine, once a symbol of dread, became a place of reckoning. Yet even in resolution, there are shadows. The mine was sealed again, this time by authorities, its depths marked with warnings no one would ignore. James Calloway was laid to rest in a ceremony attended by hundreds. His casket carried by men who'd known him, not as a legend, but as a friend, a father, a man who'd hummed old Johnny Cash tunes under his breath while he drove. His daughter, now a woman with children of her own, pressed her palm to the coffin and whispered, "You're home now." But the question lingers, doesn't it? For every mystery solved, how many others remain buried? How many families still wait, still hope, still stare at old thermoses and wonder? Perhaps the greatest lesson of James Calloway's story isn't the horror of what happened, but the fragile, stubborn persistence of those who refused to let him be forgotten. It's in the way a community can carry a wound for decades and still find the strength to heal. It's in the quiet courage of a woman who kept a light on in the window for 30 years, even when the world told her to move on. And it's in the realization that closure isn't always neat. Sometimes it's a rusted truck, a locked door, and a logbook's final, desperate words. Proof that the past, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface. So take a moment. Let the weight of this settle. Think of the James Calloways of the world, the ones still missing, still waiting in the dark, and ask yourself, what will you remember when the legends fade? What truths will you carry forward? Because in the end, it's not the mysteries that define us, it's the humanity we choose to see in them.